Hello everyone, today we talk about attacks and assaults in trench warfare during World War I. A good, peaceful and happy and serene topic to start the new year, but actually we address quite often trench warfare, at least World War I, and especially as far as it concerns, but the myths that are being created about it for mostly for political reasons and the way we've interpreted that war. That surely is one of the most overlooked in our history. I think, and exactly because of the sometimes the superficiality, the way it's addressed. Today we will not talk specifically about the doctrine standing behind trench warfare. We may, if you're interested, we may make a video soon, given that I have no problem at that point. We start talking about this though, looking at the practicals, properly at the tactical dimension of the attacks, right? So something that goes beyond the shelling and the broader strategical situation, but just to give up the brutal, actually, picture of how this was carried out. Just a word span here and there. Of course, we'll address so many other topics like the construction of the trenches, the structure of them, other aspects of gas and trench warfare. That is all quite important. Today, we really look at what fundamentally the attack was, right? Not even how it was conceived properly, but how the thing came into action, and what was the ideal, also, if you want, behind this, always given that this was the preferable way of carrying it out. But first of all, in many instances, there were not the means, right, the satisfactory means to achieve that, aside from the brutality of the sheer consumption and annihilation of the forces that were sent in waves to perform the same thing. Actually, attacks against trenches succeeded sometimes. Notoriously, they were launched just because they were effective in a way. The problem, if anything, was mostly holding the position after the attacks. And if you look at the Western Front, you basically have this line that goes from Switzerland to the North Sea that didn't move for 4 years, basically in if not very few tens of kilometers, and this is something that gives you properly mostly the strategical picture of the wall that makes you reflect on how the standstill of it was, which is not a eminently tactical problem, right? First of all, this is something we have repeated over and over again. When we think of trench warfare and deeming this as a sort of dysfunctional tactics for which the reason why the Western Front was the way it was, or even other ones, which are difficultly comparable. Telling you the truth, they were not all the same. They were naturally very mobile. France, I don't know, think about the Eastern one or Africa. There were others that were even more granitic. Think about the Alpine one, but these contexts all have of course, a lot in common as far as trench warfare is concerned, but at the same time, they're produced by factors that, in fact, do not have to do largely with the tactics employed. Right? This is perhaps the thing we had to start from. The idea that these tactics were a failure is a myth. Right? These were extremely sophisticated tactics. Right? Before the war, it was definitely a doctrinal chaos. Right, there was a shortcoming, a failure from the not just from the commands, but from the broader politics and society that had created those armed, those doctrine and employment of the armed forces. But after 2 or 3 months of war, basically all the belligerents had adapted quite in a very sophisticated way to trench warfare, more or less the way it would fundamentally remain. Today we will partially talk about the Stoßtruppen and actually what every country out there had, with even important forerunners, right? The idea of breaching through the trenches at that point in a strategical sense, not just for breaching into the trench itself, but properly to launch this attack. Think about Caporetto, right, where the Germans really not the Austro-Hungarians, but specifically the Germans, had specialized in that eminently tactical solution, right? Even in the auto-referentiality of the German command, but still with the idea, of course, that Germany had much less industrial resources, for example, than Britain, so that the French came up with tanks, the Germans with this eminently tactical thing, the troopers that had to be trained specifically in that way. And as you know, that didn't make them win the war, but still opened a path that essentially by the beginning of the 1920s was completely open, like nobody thought by that point that a position warfare, a trench warfare as it's been known for most of World War I would have been possible. But still there is the armored tactics. At some point in the 30s, at the beginning of the Blitzkrieg, also in a practical, applicative side. Those are all topics actually we will discuss at some point, because they're very interesting. Also, they're quite misunderstood, but they have to do. It's all a link in here with what had happened on the battlefields of World War I. Now, the point I would like to stress is also the fact that we come later, historically speaking, so that which means that we have studied what happened on these battlefields, pointing out the evidence that the same history provided us with, which means that every 20-year-old fresh lieutenant can tell you today why, I don't know, what were the mistakes, I don't know, the Somme offensive, why it's the case that today, aside from the fact times have changed, but why at the time would have not been, certain things at least could have been fixed. But we have to enter in the mindset, which is very difficult for a modern mind, including the one of those times, in a sense, to properly understand, which is that by that time, nobody in the history of mankind had carried out an operation like that. Right, and therefore World War I was new, not much because it's a matter of machine guns or shelling or whatever. The problem here stands in the fact, in the broader organizational and operational dimension that has to do with factors that by far surpass the fact that with a machine gun you can pin down units of hundreds or even thousands in a particular situation. Right, but never think that World War I was produced by technology. Technology was a mean that was created expressly for certain effects. It was miscalculated in its proper application. So that's why we will have to talk about the doctrinal side of the story, because there was indeed a mistake at the beginning. But this has nothing to do with what followed. Right, what followed was surely, suffering from certain preconceptions. It took a while before understanding how to surpass the impassive trench warfare, which, by the way, not even at the end of the war was fully surpassed, because still the conditions of the battlefields did not allow it. Not even with armor, with anything. There was a specific mechanics on the battlefields that couldn't be surpassed given the conditions there. Right, and that would come just later, and that the miscalculation of it is you can say it's virtually influent, but it's a very minor side of the story in here. So understanding this has to pass from things that go by far beyond the battlefield. Right, always remember, technology is zero, doctrine is everything. Right, and there are instances of even weapons that were created, I don't know, in the 1870s that were so far ahead in their time from a technological point of view. We're talking about the French-Prussian War, where at the time they didn't find an adequate doctrine or application. Why? Because technology was so advanced it couldn't fit the battlefield of the 1870s. And instead, those weapons, we're talking about the French mitrailleuses specifically, in the trenches of World War I, did an outstanding job, right, in the most devastating side of the story. And I start also with this video this year to naturally highlight properly the, how much we give for granted about what humans can achieve. Because what we're going to talk about now is something that, in the warmth of our houses today, with our standards of living, with whatever we got used to, is something I hope none of us will ever have to experience, right? There are, as you know, there is a debate where matter what was kind of the worst experience, and indeed World War II in terms of devastation and slaughter of civilians, etc., was by far the worst war we've ever gotten into. But as far as the soldier's perspective, especially and obviously mostly as always from a psychological point of view, World War I was a pretty damn thing, right? And it's unspeakable. And understanding these tactics is shockingly realizing what these human beings went into, right? I'm not saying that this is compared to equating to other, process of exterminations or torture or genocide, but, if you stop thinking about what these men like us were sent into, right? And we're talking about our great-grandfathers, right? And you start realizing a lot about the human mind, because these people were able to do it. And it's astonishing to see how you can literally train a man to eventually send it in the meat grinder, right? It's not enough, as we know, but fundamentally, aside from the mutinies and all this stuff, especially by 1917, in the later stages of the war, I mean, most soldiers went on fighting in these conditions, and it was pretty much it, right? World War I men were, just something more than bullets or shells. So, in a sort of fatalistic premonition, there were important commanders. Think about the Italian Cadorna. That, incidentally, the Alpine front is very fascinating because you have certain forerunners of the Stoßtruppen tactics in from the Italian side. Not even the Austro-Hungarian that also, I'm sure, had something at some point. But let's say before, right? We're talking about 1915, 1916, had already experimented how to a tactical solution to surpass the impasse, right? Consider that when the Italians started the war, that they even lacked not even machine guns or grenades, but even rifles at some point. So that gives you a dimension. And Cadorna, the Generalissimo, right, that eventually was substituted, but he was actually a good commander, as most of the commanders during World War I, before the war, had written down how talking about before the war, so before the meat grinder started, how the frontal attack would have been the inevitable final outcome of any offensive operation in modern warfare, and that therefore we would have had to prepare for this eventuality, taking it for granted, right? And this was, unfortunately, there are self-fulfilling predictions such as this one, especially, as we were saying before, as far as the miscalculations are involved, if no one believes in the possibility of different solutions. So, again, we'll leave the doctrinal side aside for today, right? But the inevitability of a frontal attack was long considered a kind of dogma, pretty much everywhere, in every country, right? And therefore it was assumed as, in a very brutal sense, it's just the soldiers had to get the thing done, not even question the thing, right? And this under-evaluation of the human factor was in contrast actually with the same almost social Darwinism that stood behind the idea of, I don't know, the furor teutonicus or furor gallicus, when the concept that the nationalistic idea that fundamentally that people is special or has some quality intrinsic, and it's kind of Superman, and they have to attack. And then, well, World War I showed pretty damn well that humans are great altogether, right? And that those people will think that the sum of them is more special than another. Learn the hard way that their supermen get slaughtered like pigs, like anyone else, right? And that in order not to happen, and in actually exalting the great human qualities that we have, there would take an enormous effort and an important genius and a courage even just to go beyond certain ideas were deemed not to fit in that picture. And there were many contradictions, by the way, because think about the role of artillery, right? There was this strange thing for which artillery had to literally win the ground, as it was said about the German command, and then the infantry would just move in. Well, what kind of supermen are those who just wait for the machines to do their job and just to occupy a ground? I mean, they don't even exalt the quality of those men, right? It's not a question of... there was a brutal counter. The idea was just concentrated this overwhelming power of fire, which, by the way, shows you how deeply aware the commands before World War I were of the potential weapons. Right? The myth that these guys didn't understand that a machine gun could really stop all that amount of soldiers, that shelling would fundamentally wouldn't work to wipe out the defenses, and that it would give plenty of time from interior lines for the enemies to flow into, and this required this major diversion bombardments. Think about how it happened for Verdun or the Somme, and to trick the enemy into this major strategical movements, right? That is all something that was clearly understood, but it was so understood, in fact, that the human factor was taken away, the moral one. Right, you have to send this man fighting for something. You have to give them credit for what they do. You have to exalt their capacity. You have to make them believe in what they can do. Sending them just as a mean of accompaniment, let's say, to do the operation done as a mathematical equation is definitely not a way to boost those men moral. Also because, frankly, they will be exterminated. Right, and this is pretty evident, given how things have gone, right? But do not think in this regard that there was a stupid evil behind that, in the sense that those commanders were essentially concerned with a silly technological show-off, right? These persons were pretty damn aware of the integrated system that was being set in motion. Right, and it was not easy to understand it at the time, what the outcome would have been. And as far as trench warfare actually was performed, well, this had reached, however, certain extremely sophisticated levels of achievement. I mean, the idea, the myth that trench warfare was something primitive or stupid or, unsophisticated is just what a person who has never studied this war can ever imagine to think. It was extremely sophisticated. In fact, in reality, it was not at all obvious that frontal assaults would fail. On the contrary, as we've said, often the initial objective of the offensive was achieved. These assaults worked. They did. They managed to storm the enemy trenches. Only that it was just as frequent that one was able not only to exploit the success, but also only to defend what was achieved by an enemy counterattack, right? And in this, even if you look at the thing in terms of mathematical equation, still was not known in the beginning, right? I mean, the idea of how even, trench warfare, I mean, the trenches proper and their structure were built just by sheer, I mean, at the beginning, in the first weeks of the war, they just exploited the craters of shelling. That's how the first trenches were born, and eventually they became extremely well built and articulated, and very apt to their task, right? But the question is, until you don't try that, you cannot know, right? This is not a deterministic. I mean, war is not a deterministic thing, so we can excuse, in a sense, a part of the miscalculation, and also considering something which, if you think that trench warfare was simply stupid and useless, you will never understand, and that's how most people actually try to make you buy the thing, is that when you send all these men to die in an attack like that, it's not that the enemy didn't suffer anything. You wiped out a consistent amount of enemy forces at the same time. So when you say, oh, but these attacks were useless because they didn't manage to break the front. Yes, but do you have an idea of how many enemies they had killed and how many others had necessarily stayed there to maintain the front? I mean, in terms of political and strategical resources, that was the functional thing. I mean, there was no other way to fight it. Also, let's be very clear about this. There was no other way at the time to fight that war. I mean, the alternative was not fighting it. Because if you had to fight it, that's how the thing had come to be. At least in Western Europe, with that specific situation. But once again, it's not a machine gun. It's the fact that there were those specific countries. You pick Germany, you pick France, you pick United Kingdom. You pick their demographic capacity, economical capacity, industrial capacity. And it came for those broader things that have nothing to do with machine guns to maintain the front for those 4 years, right? Mesopotamia was something else, right? Galicia was something else. Eastern Africa was something else, right? So never get tricked by the thing, these were just stupid people who didn't know, they just wanted to, were bloodthirsty maniacs that wanted to send men to die for no reason. It made a huge freaking difference. Think about all the Zonzo offensives. I mean, you say, well, they failed basically repeatedly. Yes, but do you have an idea how many Austro-Hungarians were actually kept on that front? And how many, for example, were not diverted on the western one? Or, this is a big deal, right? Also considering that in this whole picture, there were also other interesting scenarios that are somewhat overlooked. Let's leave away the war at sea, but I think even Gallipoli, at the end of the day, was caused simply by the impossibility to know that the Dardanelles could be forced navally speaking. But since some French and British ship had been blown up by the Ottoman mines, they said, okay, well, no, we have to try to think via land because we can't break through. And that even if it's a war at sea, that makes you understand how sometimes you don't really know, you have no idea how the thing will process. So all the attrition that comes through that brings also to a stasis, to an idea, okay, before we send hundreds of thousands of men to die, we have to realize that this can occur whether we do this or we do that, and we have to be dramatically careful about whether to do it or not. But until you do it, you cannot know how it will turn out, right? So these are questions that are rarely understood, right? The idea is that these commanders were just a bunch of bloodthirsty bastards. That's a completely unhistorical assertion. I mean, it has literally nothing to do with what happened historically, with military logic, with the theory of the art of war, and the practice of the art of war. It doesn't consider anything. And the reason why we think this, I cannot digress on it now because we have to keep talking about the attacks here, but specifically we have to realize that there are reasons that go beyond, far beyond any tactics that was performed, about which people normally do not even question themselves. So now let's examine especially the frontal assault, right? Isolating it from what preceded it and from what followed, right? So first of all, let's point out again that this is just an ideal form of assault, right? One of its most evolved, an abstract frontal assault, if we want, that was on paper what was objectively in this ideal conditions how the thing had to be carried out. And everything could change from the ground, the enemy trenches, the enemy defense in general, the availability of weapons, for all the things that you can ever imagine. That of course, as we study in the Funkrieg, you can make every single damn situation being different from another by far, and that therefore cannot be applied identically the whole time. So the enemy trench was kind of the Trojan type one. I mean, this idea of intrusions and protrusions, right, that create this fundamentally that can allow to this enfilade fire when the enemy comes in, and that makes also the internal part of the trench fundamentally invisible when you enter in one portion, because it goes like a snake, right, up and down. So you don't know what's behind the curve, behind the corner, right? And this gave naturally a very important edge to the defenders, right? Because those who intruded didn't know what was beyond the next corner. This naturally could be a problem also for the defenders in certain situations, but generally speaking, it's much harder to approach, also considering the angles of fire from the outside and still slowing down the advance inside, right? So, as we know, the enemy trench was normally well defended with machine gun positions. And then the first condition for carrying out an attack was a clear numerical superiority, right? And which came through this, according to this absolutely empirical evaluation by the commands. As we were saying before, there was no manual that could tell you what were the ratios of strength for, in terms of numerical superiority in order to launch a successful attacks. You have to think that some attacks were launched with a survival expectancy of 20%. Now think of having, to attack, knowing that in 4/5 of the cases you will be a casualty. Now, this was calculated empirically, so they had a, even a spot on evaluation in such matters. We're talking here about the sheer realization that it's an annihilation warfare, right? At least ideal. And then what matters here is how determined to go towards their death that your men are, which is not an easy thing to achieve, right? And that couldn't be carried out like maniacally also in all circumstances, right? It's not that literally these men were thrown into the mid grinder without heart, without realizing that at least the enemy could suffer the same amount, and that therefore there was a practical achievement, so that if at least your men died, the enemy suffered equally, right? So that nobody was happy of sending their men to death, right? And also, as the mutinies demonstrated, there was an important problem at some point to give these men hope, to have to give them something to fight for. That was mostly towards the end of the war, where these men were tired, but also where naturally things had bogged down at the point that it had become apparent that too much couldn't be asked, and that new solutions had to come into place, but also still in an international picture in which there were enormous pressures. I mean, just think how the British and the French were asking the Americans with extreme insistence, of course, to send as many men as possible, and all the pressure could be exercised. The front was unstable. Think about the Kaiserschlacht, or I also considered that, as far as I understand, I mean, certain contexts are much less documented than, even Germany, that was a modern industrialized country and so on. It's as far as I understand, is way less documented than, of course, the British troops. But let's not speak about the Eastern Front or the Ottoman one. I mean, even think about something that happened like the Armenian genocide. In the meanwhile, I mean, we have a scarcity of source. You're talking about realities that didn't even have a stable, census system. I mean, we don't even know how many millions actually died, and that gives you a dimension of how, of course, the Western Front has polarized our attention for obvious reasons, but there were also other realities that we have dramatically overlooked, and that should be brought a bit more on the fore. There are certain accounts of German medics in Mesopotamia. I mean, Ottoman soldiers actually eating each other because they didn't have to, right? But anything that can be imagined is unfortunately what we have here. Consider that what happened in the trenches is something that deeply impacted also World War II. I mean, think about during World War II, the British obsession towards logistics. Well, because the guys in command at the time were those who had suffered the thirst and the hunger in the trenches of World War I. Other countries had taken it, differently. The French maintained a defensivistic mindset that for which even tanks eventually would be developed in that sense, and we know what happened in 1940 because of that. But these are all things we'll talk about on another occasion. So the attacking unit came out of the trench with a precise sequence. Naturally, the movements were all synchronized. There were problems, especially when crossing no man's lands, when you lost contact even with your own artillery. It happened in the Somme, for example, with Haig, that actually did a good job at the end of the day, but he's the bloodthirsty monster once again. They lost contact with their own artillery. They got lost, right? And consider the spectral and completely leveled scenario that a no man's land is. Here you even lack the points of reference because it's just a wasteland of craters and and all you can imagine in between, and there are concrete problems even in just advancing through it. So the units came out, and once it was in no man's land, the trench was occupied by the units destined for the next use. So even just psychologically speaking, of leaving your own trench, knowing that it's going to be occupied by others because you're going to be sent in and you're not expected to come back. Because either you take the enemy trench or you die fundamentally. And you know that this is not just a matter of choice, right? So the units came out on different lines, right? The first line was composed of fusiliers, machine gunners, and grenadiers. Now, as we were saying before, this is an optimistic picture. Some attacks were launched even by being short of all of three of these equipment, right? And we're talking about grenadiers. Here we're talking about men with hand grenades, which means, if you think about it, that basically in order to storm the enemy trenches with that, you have to come close at least 20-25 meters under enemy fire. Right, and you also have to stretch yourself out to throw the thing, right, if you want it to be effective. So just think about what it means. So this first line had the specific aim to respond as effectively as possible to enemy fire, right, coming as close as possible to the enemy trench, right, and you understand what this means. Before we were talking about the grenadiers, but even machine gunners were fundamentally to oppose the enemy fire. It was, well placed and usually definitely better than better employable and than the assaulting ones. Naturally, in a situation that had to be preceded by shelling, so it was rough, and that's why for both sides, and that's why of course, where certain sectors would break, other would resist. It was also a statistic thing. It was a bet, a gamble, right? But the point is exactly that you have to advance fundamentally under enemy fire by reaching with your own weapons at a distance. It could be enough to at least suppress the enemy and to eventually, as we'll see now, pass at the actual assault. So in practice, this line operated as a mobile fire platform to even just attract and divert enemy fire, and in turn making suppression shots, right? That was the specific aim. They were the first line, so they were the ones they would get most of the enemy fire. And consider what this means in terms of not just you're meant to deliver a hell of fire to the enemy, but getting a hell of fire from the enemy. So it's probably the worst position to be in. And behind this line, there would be other riflemen, and riflemen armed with grenade launchers acting in support, right? There were actually grenade launchers as well, but the most frequent equipment, at least as far as the majority of people involved to attack, was the hand grenade, as we were saying before. And this line acted in order to provide close fire support to the front line. So hopefully, after having suppressed the enemy or kept him busy, to operate some extra fire, even to to start wiping out who was inside the trench, because with their curved shot, the grenade launchers had a chance to hit inside of the enemy trench. So this line acted both to as a fire overwhelmer and also starting to hit inside the enemy trench that had to be stormed, right? So to create the shock inside. So once within useful shooting range, this line could also stop and take action continuously, at least until the next line intervened, right? So they were more flexible. They acted technically as a reserve, but they had this flexibility of going back and forth according to the intensity of the enemy fire. Then there was probably the third line that completed the device of the first wave of the attack, right? As we will see, there will be also reserves behind them, but fundamentally these were the guys who went for the attack proper. They were the attackers. They were armed with grenades and hand-to-hand weapons, right? We're talking about maces, daggers, right? We'll see them later, speaking of the trench storming. Their role was to enter the trench and face their opponents in close combat. The rifle with the bayonet mounted was often too bulky to be used in confined spaces of the trench, right? So there would be actually automatic weapons that were preferred, smaller ones, pistols, and so on, but also cold steel. That was used in a variety of ways. Even just certain entrenching tools were used sometimes to wound the enemy, and it was rough, right? If you look, I think you have seen multiple times, aside from the picture in here, that the weapons were actually used in trench storming. It seems to have come back to the Middle Ages. You don't just see plate armor. It was actually used for those who would break into barbed wires and being hit by machine guns, with not much of an effect, but still better than nothing. But here we're talking about some of the most violent ways of, because there was probably no armor otherwise. So think about smashing someone with a mace with no protection, or using dagger and so on. And there were specialized units also at some point that would take pride of their own capacity to perform this ruthless task. And behind the first wave was kept a reserve, often also deployed in a column, right? The purpose of which was to renew the attack in the same way as the previous one, if it failed, or to occupy the trench if it was successful. The reason why these troops were deployed in column is that it's for the sake of there are parts of the reason what we were saying before. Crossing no man's land, it's easier to have a column, to get lost, to maintain the cohesion during crossing. The first line of this line, the first ranks of this line were deployed in line actually, and they would be sent here and there to reinforce, to back up the units that of the first three lines, as we've seen, were more specifically equipped for doing the task. So they were just properly a reserve, and they would back the first units up gradually. So it would be safer to maintain them in column, just to gradually send the various troops in without creating this too extended front of men, and not exposing themselves too much to enemy fire, and remaining, let's say, focused on, it's, as we were saying before, it's much easier to just maintain the formation if you have to think about what's in front of you and not much you have on the side, right? And such reserve was more rarely used to exploit a success, though, because attacking the subsequent entrenched lines of in-depth defense, right? Because the probability that the first wave had been fully successful, in fact, was very low, and these troops were not equipped nor deployed specifically to carry out the assault, right? So they were just backups in a sense, and that's also the reason they would be deployed in column and not in line, and during the advance. And the whole process described up to now was repeated over and over again, right? Here we're talking about just one wave that we've seen. The trench from which they had left had been filled with another wave that would start again. So just imagine what this means to arrive just in front of the enemy trenches where the carnage had taken place. I mean, just from a moral point of view. And people massacred in most horrifying ways, and you basically having to go over them to assault. This process was repeated until the units destined for attack were exhausted. That is to say, when there were no men to send anymore. And we understand what this means. So, given this ideal sequence of frontal attack, we can describe also what specifically happened inside the trenches. In the fight inside the trenches. So, as we have just seen, this task was assigned to a number of specialized troops placed in a rear line, right? And when the former had sufficiently weakened the enemy defenses, it would be their turn to penetrate it to try to suppress the last hotbeds of resistance. So, immediately before entering the trench, grenades were thrown to avoid finding enemies and to create a fairly large safety zone. Once inside, it could still happen to end up in the midst of the enemies, right? Because, yeah, you throw the grenade, maybe you blow up some guy, but then, as we have seen, just because of the form trenches, it's difficult to even understand what was inside, and other enemies can come from both sides. In the case in which this happened, a furious melee immediately began, during which there was no quarter, and every means was good to overwhelm the opponent. The space in the trench could be very narrow, right? So blunt, often improvised. Some of them were not made even proper to cross, to walk through them, right? There were certain walkways, but they were not conceived ideally for assaulters, naturally, to favor the assaulters inside the trench, and just to, for the guys to get over the top, and for the rest to, the guys inside to go over the top, and for the rest to provide enough protection from the shelling. The trenches, as we've seen, also could be often improvised, so either blunt or short-sighted weapons were often used. Especially knives and the like. It was a kind of boarding in this assault, if you pass the term, with weapons that you can see also in the pictures that I've inserted in here. However, very frequently another occurrence could take place. The trench, in fact, was in itself a fortress, and had to be conquered even though it had already been penetrated. This is typical of, for anybody who has studied medieval warfare, fortifications know how it's not that, the trenches are the simplest form of fortification, but at the end of the day, things can be way more complex. It can be multiple levels. So, as we were saying at the beginning, the simplest structure of the simplest form of the trench was constituted by the Trojan gate type, right? The idea you have these protrusions, so the enemy, if he wants to attack a sector, has to expose his sides, right? So creating a corner of an angle of death from which you can't target him from the side, and not making him see, beyond the sides in this sense. And this was designed to prevent, by means of the recessed parts called kind of cross pieces, from being taken by enfilade fire. And therefore the trench became the scene of a long and tiring fight conducted step by step for each one of these crossings, with meticulous determination from the assailants and equally strenuously defended by the occupants, right? So fundamentally, the assaulting squads were sectioned in a similar way to how the lines of the units were, because there were the attackers proper, the grenadiers, the grenade bearers, then the NCO in command, the reserves. So the cross pieces constitute the barriers behind which the opponents can hide. They're behind the corner and behind the corner from the other side, right? So you have to go. Ideally, you're walking through the trench. You find you're assaulting it. The trench turns right in a square angle, then it turns left in a square angle, and then it turns once again left in a square angle. You don't know what the enemy is, if it's behind the first corner, the second, the third one. So a section of the attackers will line up around the corner of the crosspiece, waiting for the grenadiers to accurately throw their grenades beyond it, right? And at that point, you don't even know whether the enemy is actually there, right? But the idea is that, shock and assault in here, so you try to create that confusion that allows eventually, to exploit the attack. So any enemies lurking should at least be stunned in that position, allowing the attackers to be able to annihilate them with little difficulty. The enemy, however, can perform the same action, hidden by the most distant cross pieces, and he will target the grenadiers in order to isolate the attackers from their hiding places, because the grenadiers have come as close to the corner as they can. They throw the grenades, and the attackers are usually already beyond their crossing, so that they can immediately attack. And so the grenadier is fundamentally between the attackers and the NCO with the reserves. So if you knock them out, you don't just prevent them from throwing the grenades, but you separate the attackers from the NCO and the reserves. So you can overwhelm them, creating this gap in the middle of the line. And at this point, it may be inevitable and even convenient to seek hand-to-hand contact with the attackers themselves, who are unsupported. With the contenders mix, it's no longer possible to throw grenades, too, right? Because if you've sent your attackers, you risk killing them by throwing the grenades behind the corner. So, and it is also inevitable, in a sense, for those who have survived to join the fray, right? And only when all threats have really ceased can prisoners be taken, right? If the mind can still make it, right? Because if you went through that, right, crossing no man's land, storming the trench, and cleaning it, you're not in a psychological state that from which you can expect too much from a human being, even in terms of mercy, right? And the most unspeakable kinds of violence were performed in this sense, and you would have not known to see what actually happened in those trenches. There is naturally a shaded reality depending on the situations, but this was one thing is a carefully pre-planned operation where there is also the possibility of catching the enemy by surprise. It happens sometimes at night, and make them surrender. Actually, entire units that often was waited, I don't know, for the new unit to settle in that were not used to the trench yet, so that you could exploit any possible weakness from the enemy side, and there are situations of even of gallantry, of chivalry, of officers that recognized the bravery, the ability of the enemy, and even surrendering, but giving consigning the gun and so on. But in the meat grinder of some of the most devastating attacks, World War I, this was like everyday business, and under conditions of pressure that we can't even come close to imagine. So you can unfortunately instead realize what this could lead to in terms of sheer violence and venting all this inane frustration that was at the base of this huge tragedy. So this is just a short video to illustrate certain aspects of, at least, of trench warfare, and specifically the tactics of the attacks. We'll come back on the topic at some point more thoroughly, and of course we'll discuss about World War I extensively. There is actually a lot of stuff I could make on this, so I think this is the first time ever I make a video on World War I. Well, yes, I think we need to expand a little bit more in the second part of the modern age and contemporary history, because we don't cover that much, and yet it can be useful. As you know, I'm just a humble medievalist, so I do what I can about other eras, but I honestly got interested in them often, and just sometimes I have to clarify a bit my thoughts to organize the video, and that's it. We can't talk about it, and I hope surely there is much to be learned from this stuff, because it's not simply about the technicality of it. It's really understanding that this happened because it was framed in one context. Today we abstracted much, but at the same time we focused essentially on what took place in this regard. I mean, from a concrete point of view, in the heat of the attack. And we also, I think, skipped some the other, I don't know, we could expand on how the actual weapons were used, but I mean, you understand it becomes just pedantic to say, to wanting to make it an omnicomprehensive explanation of how everything could change. Weapons function the way they do, so you can all understand how certain things actually occurred, but the important was rather to realize the functionalization, the order, and how much was required to these people. That I find as actually one of the most interesting topics altogether in the tragicity of this myth grinder. But anyhow, for now, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.